On a warm spring evening in Chicago, millionaire businesswoman Evelyn Carter attended a charity auction she had almost canceled. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and quiet conversations as men in tailored suits and women in evening gowns drifted between tables displaying donated antiques, paintings, and jewelry. Evelyn barely noticed any of it. At 58, she had spent 3 decades building Carter Freight Solutions into one of the largest logistics companies in the Midwest. Her schedule was always full, and her assistant had practically forced her to attend tonight, telling her she needed one evening away from spreadsheets. So here she was, smiling politely and thinking about work, until she saw it. On the corner of a table sat a small silver music box. It wasn't the most expensive item in the room, not even close, but something about it made her stop. An angel with outstretched wings rested on the lid, tiny sapphires forming its eyes, and the silver had aged beautifully, carrying the soft glow that only time could create. Evelyn frowned because she knew that angel, or perhaps she knew someone who once owned it. A volunteer approached and said it was a beautiful piece that came from an old storage unit auction. Evelyn didn't answer. She picked up the box, which felt strangely familiar in her hands, and then she opened it. A soft melody floated into the room, "You are my sunshine," and suddenly she couldn't breathe. A voice echoed inside her mind, cold and sharp as if no time had passed at all. "If you don't pay the rent by Friday, you and the baby will have to leave." The ballroom vanished, the music vanished, the people vanished, and Evelyn was no longer a millionaire. She was 25 years old again, 8 months pregnant, terrified, and completely alone. Kansas, 1991. Rain tapped softly against the window of her tiny apartment as the landlord stood in the doorway holding a clipboard, looking uncomfortable as he said he was sorry but he had already given her 2 extensions. Evelyn couldn't even look at him, one hand resting on her swollen belly and the other gripping the kitchen counter as she said she just needed more time. He told her he didn't have more time to give, and she begged him please, but then he said the words that had haunted her for more than 30 years, "If you don't pay the rent by Friday, you and the baby will have to leave." Silence, a long terrible silence, as she looked around the apartment. There wasn't much, a tiny sofa from a thrift store, a folding table, a crib she had bought secondhand, and a box of baby clothes someone from church had donated. Everything she owned could fit into the back seat of a car, and she was about to lose even that. The landlord softened and said he wished he could help, then he left, the door clicked shut, and Evelyn finally broke. She slid onto a chair and covered her face. 3 months earlier her entire world had collapsed when her boyfriend Daniel Pierce died in a trucking accident on an icy highway. He never met his son, never saw the nursery, never heard the baby's heartbeat. One day she was planning a future, and the next day she was planning a funeral. After the medical bills and the funeral expenses, every dollar disappeared. She sold her television, she sold her jewelry, she picked up extra shifts, she skipped meals, still it wasn't enough. The baby kicked and she placed both hands on her stomach, whispering that she was trying so hard as tears slid down her cheeks. The next morning Evelyn put on her work boots and drove to the Tyson chicken processing plant. The building smelled of cold air and machinery, and the work was brutal, 10 hours on her feet with long shifts and little pay. But she needed every dollar. She tied her apron and joined the line, where a few workers smiled at her but most looked exhausted. Then she saw Martha Reed, 50 feet away, hair tied back, wearing the same blue uniform, quiet as always. Martha was older than Evelyn by a few years and had worked there much longer, never talking much or complaining, but somehow she always noticed when someone was having a hard day. That afternoon Evelyn nearly dropped a tray because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. During the break she sat alone in the locker room, not realizing she was crying until someone sat beside her. It was Martha, and for a while neither woman said anything until Martha handed her a paper napkin and asked if she was having a bad day. Evelyn laughed weakly and said bad year. Martha nodded slowly without asking questions, simply waiting, and for some reason that made Evelyn talk. She talked about Daniel, about the baby, about the rent, about being scared, about not knowing what would happen after Friday. When she finally stopped speaking she felt embarrassed and apologized, saying Martha didn't even know her. Martha looked at her and asked one simple question, how much she was short. Evelyn stared at her and said what, and Martha repeated her rent. Evelyn shook her head and said it didn't matter, but Martha insisted, asking how much. Evelyn finally said $480. Martha nodded, nothing more, and the bell rang signaling the end of the break. She stood, and before walking away she looked back and said something Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life: "Just keep going, honey." Then she returned to work, and Evelyn watched her leave, having no idea that the quiet woman in the blue uniform was about to change her entire life forever. The rest of the shift passed in a blur as Evelyn tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept returning to the same number. $480 might as well have been $4 million because she didn't have it. She had no family nearby, no savings, no one left to call. When the whistle finally blew, she changed out of her uniform and headed toward the parking lot. Then she noticed something strange. Martha's old pickup truck was still there, its headlights off and the engine cold, so she must still be inside. Evelyn thought about waiting to say goodbye, but another kick from the baby reminded her she needed to get home. She had taken only a few steps when she heard someone call her name, and she turned to see Martha walking toward her with damp hair from the rain, looking tired but smiling, holding a plain white envelope in her hand. She said she thought this belonged to Evelyn, and Evelyn frowned, asking what it was. Martha told her to open it. Inside was a stack of bills, 20s, 50s, 100s, and her breath caught as she counted once, then again, exactly $480. She looked up in shock and told Martha she couldn't take it, but Martha insisted she could and she needed it. Evelyn asked where it came from, and for the first time Martha looked away, then gave a little shrug and said she sold something she wasn't using. Evelyn stared at her and said she didn't even know her, and Martha smiled softly and said she knew enough. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes as she said she didn't know how she would ever pay her back, and Martha stepped closer, gently placing a hand on her shoulder and telling her that she didn't pay kindness back. She passed it on. The parking lot was silent except for the sound of rain as Evelyn looked at the envelope, then back at the woman standing in front of her, a woman who earned the same small paycheck she did and had no reason to help, yet here she was. Tears finally spilled down Evelyn's cheeks as she said she didn't know what to say, and Martha squeezed her shoulder and told her to say she'd keep going. Evelyn nodded and said she would, and Martha smiled and said good, then turned and walked toward her truck. Evelyn stood there for a long time, clutching the envelope against her chest, having no idea that this moment and this quiet woman would stay with her for the next 32 years. Friday came and went, the rent was paid, and for the first time in weeks Evelyn slept through the night. She still remembered standing in the landlord's office sliding the cash across the desk with shaking hands, and the man smiled and said it looked like she and the little one got to stay. She nearly cried right there. Instead she went home, sat in the tiny nursery, and thanked God for a woman named Martha Reed. The next morning she arrived at the plant carrying a paper bag containing 2 homemade sandwiches and the only luxury she could afford, a slice of apple pie from the diner down the street. When she found Martha in the break room, she set the bag on the table and told her she saved her. Martha looked inside and said she bought pie, and Evelyn said it was all she could think of. A small smile appeared on Martha's face as she cut the slice in half and said she didn't share pie with just anybody, and Evelyn laughed for the first time in months. From that day on they began eating lunch together, not as immediate friendship but slowly, the way real friendships often do. Evelyn learned that Martha was a widow whose husband Daniel Reed had died of cancer 7 years earlier, and they had never been able to have children. She lived alone in a small house outside town, liked old country songs and black coffee, and every Thursday she brought flowers to her husband's grave. But there was one thing Martha never talked about, a small empty chain around her neck that her fingers would touch without thinking sometimes during lunch. One afternoon Evelyn finally asked if she was wearing something there, and Martha looked down, her eyes seeming far away for a moment before she smiled and said she used to. Evelyn asked what it was, and Martha said a music box, very small and silver with a little angel on top that her husband gave her on their 5th anniversary. When Evelyn asked what happened to it, a long silence followed before Martha simply said she had to let it go, and she didn't explain, and Evelyn didn't ask. A few minutes later the bell rang ending their break, and as they stood up Martha looked at Evelyn's stomach and asked when the baby was coming. Evelyn said any day now, and Martha smiled and said they'd better keep her standing. As they walked back to the factory floor Evelyn noticed something. For just a second Martha touched the empty chain around her neck again and there were tears in her eyes. Evelyn had no idea that the Silver Angel music box had already become part of her story, she just didn't know it yet. 2 weeks later Evelyn's water broke in the middle of her shift. One moment she was trimming labels on a conveyor line, and the next she grabbed the edge of the table and gasped. Several women rushed toward her, but Martha got there first, putting a steady hand on her shoulder and calmly telling her they were going to have a baby. The women around them laughed nervously while someone called for a supervisor and someone else ran to get a chair, but Martha stayed beside her the entire time, telling her to breathe because that was her job right now. Another contraction hit and Evelyn grabbed Martha's hand, saying she couldn't do this, but Martha squeezed her hand and said she could, and when Evelyn said no she couldn't, Martha squeezed again and said, "Just keep going, honey." The words settled something inside her. An hour later they were at the hospital, and the labor was long, painful, and lonely with no husband beside her bed, no parents in the waiting room, no family carrying flowers, only Martha, who sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair for nearly 10 hours refusing to leave, refusing even when the nurses told her to go home and get some sleep. Just after dawn a tiny cry filled the room, a baby boy, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, perfect. The nurse placed him in Evelyn's arms and she burst into tears, whispering that he had his father's nose. Martha smiled from across the room and asked what she was going to call him, and Evelyn looked down at her son, then at Martha, and said she was naming him Daniel. For a moment the room became very quiet, and Martha's eyes filled with tears as she said that was a beautiful name. The baby yawned and wrapped his tiny fingers around Evelyn's thumb, and something inside her changed because for the first time since Daniel's death she wasn't thinking about what she had lost, she was thinking about what she still had. Later that afternoon Martha stepped out of the room and returned carrying a small blue gift bag, saying Evelyn didn't have to bring anything. She handed her a folded baby blanket she had made years ago, and Evelyn touched the soft fabric, saying it was beautiful. Martha paused and said she thought maybe someday she'd have a grandbaby to give it to, but life had other plans. Then she gently touched the baby's tiny foot and said she thought her little boy could use it. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes again as she said her name, but the older woman waved her off, saying no crying today because they had already had enough tears. Then she looked at Evelyn and said the words she would remember forever, "Sometimes family doesn't come to you the way you expect." Evelyn looked at the blanket, then at the woman sitting beside her who had paid her rent, who had sat through 10 hours of labor, who had brought a handmade blanket for a child that wasn't hers. For the first time in months she didn't feel alone anymore, and she looked at her sleeping son and whispered that he already had an angel watching over him. Neither of them knew it then, but only a few weeks later their lives would begin moving in different directions, and one day, decades from now, a Silver Angel music box would bring them together again. For the next few months life settled into a routine. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a life. Every morning Evelyn bundled little Daniel into his blanket, dropped him off with an elderly neighbor who watched children for extra money, and headed to the processing plant. Every evening she picked him up and drove home exhausted, and some nights she and the baby fell asleep on the couch before dinner, but they were surviving, and somehow surviving felt like a victory. Martha remained a steady presence in their lives, stopping by the apartment with a bag of groceries or bringing soup when Daniel had a cold, sometimes simply sitting on the floor and making silly faces until the baby laughed. Evelyn teased her one evening that she spoiled him, and Martha smiled and said she had waited a long time to spoil somebody, then kissed the top of Daniel's head. The baby giggled and a shadow crossed Martha's face, but it disappeared just as quickly. Then one cold November morning everything changed. The supervisor gathered everyone on the factory floor and announced they were cutting staff because the company was restructuring, and the room erupted in whispers as names began to be called one after another. Then he called Martha Reed, and silence fell. Martha didn't react, she simply removed her gloves, folded them neatly, and placed them in her locker. After 15 years at the plant she was being let go, and the supervisor looked uncomfortable as he said he was sorry. Martha nodded and said it was all right, with no anger and no tears, just quiet acceptance, and that somehow made it even worse. At lunch Evelyn found her sitting alone and told her she couldn't leave, but Martha smiled sadly and said it looked like she didn't have much choice. When Evelyn asked what she was going to do, Martha said she'd figure something out, and Evelyn said she needed this job, but Martha replied that they all needed things, honey, and squeezed her hand, saying she'd be okay. But for the first time since they'd met, Evelyn wasn't sure she believed her. At the end of the shift she walked Martha to her truck in the bitterly cold November wind, and neither woman wanted to say goodbye. Finally Evelyn spoke, saying she still hadn't told her what happened to that music box. Martha looked surprised, then laughed softly and said she was still curious about that old thing, and Evelyn said she was. For a long moment Martha said nothing, then she looked out at the empty parking lot and said she pawned it, years ago. Evelyn blinked and asked why, and a small smile appeared on Martha's face as she said to help someone. Before Evelyn could ask another question, Martha changed the subject and told her to get home to that baby, but something in her voice felt different, as though she were carrying a memory too heavy to share. They hugged, a long tight hug, then Martha climbed into her truck and rolled down the window, telling Evelyn to take care of herself and keep going. Evelyn smiled through sudden tears and said she would. Martha smiled back, then she drove away. Neither woman knew it then, but that would be the last time they saw each other for more than 30 years, and neither of them could imagine that one small silver angel would one day bring them back together again. Life moved quickly after that, too quickly. A few weeks after Martha lost her job, Evelyn received an offer from a small transportation company in Wichita with better pay, health benefits, and most importantly, stability for her and little Daniel. She accepted immediately. The night before she left town she drove to Martha's house, a small white farmhouse at the end of a gravel road, but the porch light was off and no truck was in the driveway. She knocked and received no answer. She waited and still nothing. Finally she left a handwritten note in the mailbox thanking her for everything and saying she didn't know where life was taking them but she would never forget her, promising she would come back and visit. She tucked a photograph inside the envelope showing baby Daniel wrapped in the blue blanket Martha had given him, then she drove away, thinking at the time it would only be for a few months, maybe a year, but life had other plans. The new job became another job, then a promotion, then another, and Evelyn discovered she had a talent for logistics, organizing routes, solving problems, and managing people. By the time Daniel started school she had become a supervisor, and a few years later she started her own trucking company with one used truck and a small loan, then 2 trucks, then 5, then 20. The years kept moving and somehow the little company kept growing. But every once in a while something would remind her of Martha, a country song on the radio, a blue blanket folded in Daniel's closet, a woman at the grocery store wearing a silver angel necklace, and every time she would think she needed to find her, to thank her properly. Then work would get busy, Daniel would need something, another year would pass, then another, until the thought became something heavier, something painful, a debt carried in her heart. One evening when Daniel was 12 he asked his mother who Martha was because she said her name sometimes when she was worried. Evelyn smiled sadly and sat down beside him, telling him there was a woman who helped them once, even more than Aunt Susan, and when he asked what she did, a long silence followed before Evelyn answered softly that she gave them a future. Daniel frowned and asked if they could go thank her, and the question hit her like a punch because she didn't know where Martha was, she hadn't seen her in years, and suddenly she realized something terrible. She had broken her promise, the promise in the mailbox, the promise to come back, the promise to visit. That night after Daniel had gone to bed, Evelyn opened an old cardboard box containing photographs, hospital bracelets, baby shoes, and a faded picture of Martha holding infant Daniel in her arms. She touched the photograph gently and whispered that she was sorry, that she should have found her, but the picture offered no answer, only silence. 32 years later, standing in a ballroom in Chicago holding a silver angel music box in trembling hands, that old guilt came rushing back because somehow, impossibly, the thing Martha had once pawned had found its way back to her. For the first time in decades, Evelyn knew exactly what she had to do. She was going to find Martha Reed, no matter how long it took. The charity auction ended 20 minutes later, but Evelyn never heard a single bid. She sat at her table with the silver music box resting in her lap, her fingers tracing the tiny angel on the lid, then she looked at the volunteer and asked who donated this. The young woman shook her head and said she was sorry but the storage company handled everything and it came from an abandoned unit. Evelyn's heart sank because that word carried too many possibilities, a move, a foreclosure, a death, and she didn't want to think about the last one. She asked if she could tell her where the storage unit was, but the volunteer hesitated, saying she didn't think they were supposed to. Evelyn said she would pay 10 times whatever this box was worth, and the young woman's eyes widened, but Evelyn immediately regretted how that sounded because money wasn't the answer, not tonight. She took a breath and said please, that this wasn't about the box but about the woman who owned it. Something in her voice must have reached the volunteer because a few minutes later the event manager approached, and after hearing the story he quietly handed her a business card for a storage facility in Topeka, Kansas, less than 100 miles from where she'd once lived. Her pulse quickened. Kansas. After 32 years everything was leading back to Kansas. That night she couldn't sleep, sitting in her penthouse apartment overlooking the Chicago skyline as the city lights glittered outside her windows, but all she could see was a small apartment in Kansas, a crib, a second-hand sofa, a young woman crying at her kitchen table, and a quiet coworker who had changed everything. At 2 in the morning she made a decision and picked up her phone, waking her assistant Melissa to say she was canceling her meetings, all 3 board meetings tomorrow. Melissa asked if she should be worried, and Evelyn looked at the music box and said she thought something important just happened. By sunrise Evelyn was on her private plane with the Silver Angel sitting on the seat beside her. As the plane climbed into the clouds, memories kept returning, Martha teaching her how to stretch a grocery budget, holding baby Daniel, cutting a slice of pie in half, and saying those words, "You don't pay kindness back, honey. You pass it on." Evelyn closed her eyes, wondering how many times she had repeated those words over the years to employees, to friends, even to her own son, and yet she had never found the woman who first said them. The guilt settled heavily in her chest. 2 hours later she walked into the storage facility in Topeka where the manager, an older man with reading glasses, looked at the music box and frowned, saying he remembered this beautiful little thing that came from Unit 114. Evelyn asked who rented it, and the man typed into his computer before stopping, his expression changing. When she asked what it was, he looked up and said the renter's name was Martha Reed. For a moment Evelyn forgot how to breathe because she had found the right person after all these years. She asked if he had an address, and the man hesitated, saying he wasn't really supposed to, but she said please, and he studied her face before slowly nodding and scribbling an address onto a piece of paper, a trailer park outside a small town called Fairview. He looked at her kindly and said he hoped she found what she was looking for. Evelyn looked down at the paper in her hand, hoping so too because for the first time in 32 years finding Martha no longer felt impossible, it felt terrifying. She suddenly realized something. She had spent decades imagining this reunion but she had never asked herself one question: what if Martha needed help and she had come 30 years too late? The trailer park sat at the edge of Fairview, Kansas, where the paved road turned to gravel and the field seemed to stretch forever. Evelyn parked her rental car and looked at the piece of paper in her hand, Lot 27. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the flight, what she would say, how she would thank Martha, how she would place the music box in her hands and tell her that every good thing in her life had started with one act of kindness. Now suddenly she wasn't sure she could move. She looked down at the Silver Angel, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. Lot 27 was at the very end of the road, a small white trailer with peeling paint, a sagging porch, 2 flower pots with dead plants, and a faded wind chime gently moving in the breeze. The sight stopped her cold. This couldn't be right, not Martha, not the woman who had saved her. She had imagined a modest little house, a garden, a cozy kitchen, not this. Her chest tightened because for 32 years while her own life had grown bigger and brighter, Martha's had somehow grown smaller. Evelyn slowly walked up the steps and knocked, but there was no answer. She knocked again and still nothing, and a voice behind her made her jump, a neighbor saying she was not home and asking if she was looking for Martha. Evelyn said yes, and the neighbor smiled kindly and said she should be back soon because Tuesdays were her doctor days. The word unsettled her, and she asked if she was okay. The neighbor sighed and said she had a rough few years, heart trouble and arthritis so bad some mornings she could barely open a jar, and then she added that she still worked though, at the grocery store, only part-time now. She smiled sadly and said that woman wouldn't quit working if you tied her to a chair. Evelyn couldn't speak. The woman who had given away her last treasure, the woman who had rescued a frightened young mother, was 70 years old and still working part-time at a grocery store. The unfairness of it nearly broke her heart. The neighbor continued, saying she never complains though, always helping everybody else, and that sounded exactly like Martha. Evelyn asked when she would be back, and the neighbor said about an hour, then paused and asked if she would like to wait inside because she leaves the door unlocked. Evelyn blinked and asked unlocked, and the neighbor laughed and said this is Kansas, honey. A small smile appeared on Evelyn's face because some things never changed. A few minutes later she stepped inside the tiny trailer, immaculately clean with a worn sofa, a bookshelf, a little kitchen table, and dozens of photographs everywhere. The first picture she recognized made her hand fly to her mouth, baby Daniel wrapped in the blue blanket, another picture of Daniel at age 6 missing his front teeth, another of his high school graduation photo, and another of a newspaper clipping reading, "Local businesswoman wins Entrepreneur of the Year." Evelyn stared at it, then slowly looked around the room at photographs of her, of Daniel, newspaper articles, magazine covers, a picture of her company headquarters, a photograph from an interview she had given nearly 10 years ago. Tears filled her eyes because Martha had followed her life all these years, she had never truly lost her. Then Evelyn noticed something else on the bookshelf, an old frame containing the note she had left in the mailbox 32 years earlier, the paper yellow with age but the words still readable, "I promise I'll come back and visit." Her knees nearly gave out. The promise she had broken, but Martha had kept the note for 32 years as if she believed that one day Evelyn really would come back. A sound outside interrupted her thoughts, a car door, then footsteps, slow and careful, coming up the porch steps. Evelyn's heart began to pound as the front door opened, and there carrying a small paper grocery bag stood Martha Reed, older, gray-haired, a little smaller than she remembered, but unmistakably Martha. The two women simply stared at each other for a very long time, then Martha's eyes dropped to the silver angel music box sitting on the table. The grocery bag slipped from her hand, an orange rolled across the floor, and in a voice barely above a whisper she said, "Well, I'll be." Then she looked up at Evelyn and her eyes filled with tears. For a long moment neither woman moved. The little trailer seemed to hold its breath as Martha looked at Evelyn, then at the silver angel music box, then back at Evelyn again. Tears slowly filled her eyes as she whispered her name, as though she couldn't quite believe it. Evelyn tried to answer but she couldn't, because after 32 years, after all the success, all the awards, all the meetings and headlines, she suddenly felt 25 years old again, a frightened young mother standing in a parking lot. Finally she managed to speak, saying hello, and the older woman gave a shaky laugh, then another, then her hand flew to her mouth and she said "Oh my goodness" as a tear rolled down her cheek. Without another word she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Evelyn. The hug was soft, fragile, and somehow it broke something open inside both of them. Evelyn held on tightly, far more tightly than she had planned, whispering that she was so sorry. Martha pulled back slightly and asked for what, and Evelyn said for disappearing, for taking 32 years, for not coming back. A small smile appeared on Martha's face as she said she came, and the simplicity of those words made Evelyn's eyes fill again. She had expected anger, questions, disappointment. Instead she was welcomed home. Martha looked toward the table and asked if that was really the music box, and Evelyn nodded. The older woman's hand trembled as she said she never thought she'd see it again, and she slowly walked over and sat down, staring at it for several seconds as if afraid to touch it, then she reached out and her fingers brushed the silver angel. She said she used to polish this every Sunday, and Evelyn asked if she remembered the scratch, and Martha smiled and said she made it. They both laughed because the same memory had survived 3 decades, a freezing afternoon, a tired young mother, a silver angel slipping from her hands, and 2 women laughing while trying to fix it. The room became quiet again, then Evelyn noticed something, the empty chain around Martha's neck that she still wore even now, after all these years. Her throat tightened as she said she kept the chain, and Martha touched it absent-mindedly and said she supposed she did, never stopped missing him or the box. Evelyn swallowed hard and asked the question that had lived in her heart for 32 years, why she did it, the money, when she hardly knew her. The older woman leaned back in her chair and smiled, saying she wondered if she'd ask that someday, then she looked out the window and began telling her story. When her husband died she was 29 and scared all the time, unable to sleep, not knowing how she was supposed to keep going. Then one day an older woman from church brought her groceries, not having much herself, and she told her something she never forgot. No one should have to carry fear all by themselves. The room fell silent as Martha continued, saying she never forgot those words, and then one day she walked into the break room and saw a young woman 8 months pregnant trying very hard not to cry. She recognized that look because she had worn it herself, so she did what somebody once did for her. Evelyn lowered her head and cried, not because of the money or the music box, but because the kindness that had saved her had started even earlier, passed from one hurting person to another generation after generation, like a light refusing to go out. After a while Martha squeezed her hand and smiled, saying those words Evelyn had carried with her for more than 30 years, "Just keep going, honey." And for the first time since she had walked into that trailer, Evelyn smiled through her tears. The two women sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had gone down, and at some point Martha made coffee, and at some point they both laughed, and at some point they both cried again. 32 years had disappeared as though they had only missed a few weekends. Then Evelyn's eyes wandered toward a Bible resting on a shelf beside the couch with something sticking out of it, a small folded piece of paper, old, yellowed, worn. Martha followed her gaze and said she supposed she should throw that thing away one day. Evelyn asked what it was, and for a moment Martha didn't answer. Then she stood and carefully pulled the paper from between the pages, holding it in her hands for several seconds before passing it across the table. Evelyn unfolded it and her breath caught. It was a pawn ticket dated April 12, 1991, the same week she had needed rent money. Her hands began to tremble as she read the description, one silver angel music box with sapphires, and below it, 90-day redemption period. Silence, a long painful silence, as Evelyn whispered that she never sold it. Martha smiled sadly and said no, she pawned it, always thinking she would get it back. Evelyn looked at the faded paper with edges nearly worn through and asked why she kept this for 32 years. The older woman gave a little shrug and said hope is a funny thing, then her eyes drifted toward the music box as she said she used to think maybe next month she'd have enough money, then next month became next year, and then she got used to missing it. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes as she said she should have had it back, but Martha smiled and said maybe, then paused and said every time she thought about it, she remembered her and that her and her little boy were okay, and somehow that made it easier. Evelyn couldn't speak. The woman sitting across from her had spent 32 years without the last gift her husband had ever given her and she had never once regretted it. Then something else caught Evelyn's eye, another piece of paper beneath the pawn ticket, and she pulled it free. Her own handwriting, the note she had left in the mailbox, her promise, "I promise I'll come back and visit." She stared at it, then slowly looked up and asked if she kept this too. Martha smiled and said of course. But Evelyn said she never came back, so she should be angry. The older woman looked genuinely surprised and asked why she would be angry, and Evelyn said because she forgot. Martha said she didn't forget, she got busy, and Evelyn shook her head saying she should have found her. Martha reached across the table and took her hand, saying life happened, honey. Tears slid down Evelyn's cheeks because for all these years she had carried a heavy silent guilt, and the woman she thought she had failed had already forgiven her long ago. She whispered that she didn't deserve her, and Martha laughed softly and said don't be ridiculous. Then she looked toward the framed photograph of little Daniel and said she gave her something too. Evelyn frowned and asked what she meant, and the older woman smiled and said she never had children or grandchildren, but those pictures made her feel like she was watching a family grow, and she was so proud of her. The words broke Evelyn's heart because all these years while she had been worrying about repaying a debt, Martha had simply been happy to see her succeed. Then the older woman looked at the music box again with trembling hands, saying she still couldn't believe it was here. Evelyn took a slow breath and gently pushed the silver angel across the table, saying it belongs to you. Martha looked at it, then looked at her, and for the first time that evening she began to cry. Martha looked at the silver music box sitting between them, then slowly shook her head and said she couldn't possibly, but Evelyn insisted it belonged to her. Martha gently pushed it back across the table, saying it found its way to her for a reason. Evelyn's eyes filled as she said it found its way to her so she could bring it home. The room fell silent as outside the wind chime on the porch sang softly. Martha stared at the little angel, then at the faded pawn ticket, then back at the music box, finally whispering that she dreamed about this. Evelyn blinked and asked what, and Martha admitted that sometimes at night she dreamed she was opening it again, laughing a small embarrassed laugh and saying a person can miss a little thing that much. Evelyn said it isn't a little thing, and Martha smiled sadly and agreed. She reached out with trembling hands, resting her fingers on the lid for a moment before opening it. "You are my sunshine" filled the little trailer as both women froze, 32 years disappearing because the music was exactly the same, soft, gentle, a little slow from age, but exactly the same. Martha's lips trembled as she carefully lifted the lid all the way, and inside the silver had dulled slightly but the engraving remained perfect. She touched the words with her fingertips, "For the days when I can't hold your hand, win this little angel and remember, you were loved enough for a lifetime. Daniel." A tear fell onto the silver, then another, as Martha covered her mouth and said she thought she'd lost this piece of him forever. Evelyn couldn't stop crying. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times on the flight to Kansas, and it still wasn't enough, because this wasn't a woman getting back a beautiful object, this was a woman getting back 32 years of memories, 32 years of love, 32 years of unfinished grief. Martha looked at the engraving again, then laughed softly through her tears and said he was so proud of this thing. Evelyn asked if he made it, and Martha nodded, saying he designed every little detail, the sapphire eyes from her grandmother's brooch, and he spent months finding someone who could put them in. She touched the angel's wings and said he used to say this angel looked like her, and that made both women laugh because Evelyn said no it doesn't, and Martha laughed and agreed. Then Martha became very quiet and looked at the music box, then at Evelyn, then at the framed photograph of baby Daniel, finally whispering that she never regretted pawning it. Evelyn frowned, and Martha said if she had to do it all over again she would do it exactly the same way because no mother should face that kind of fear alone. The words seemed to settle over the room as Evelyn lowered her head and cried, not the quiet tears of sadness but the deep uncontrollable tears that come when someone loves you far more than you think you deserve. After a long time she finally looked up and said she saved her life, but Martha smiled and said no, she just held the door open, Evelyn walked through it. For a long moment neither woman spoke, then Martha looked toward the hallway and said she would really like to see that little boy again. Evelyn smiled through her tears and said he's not so little anymore, and Martha asked how old he is now, and Evelyn said 32. Martha's eyes widened and she laughed, saying she supposed that's what happens when 32 years go by. Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen to show a picture of Daniel, 32 years old, tall, smiling, standing beside his wife and 2 little girls. Martha stared at the photograph, her hand flying to her mouth as she said oh my goodness and touched the screen, asking if those were his babies. Evelyn said they are, and tears filled Martha's eyes again as she said he was a grandfather's dream. Evelyn laughed and said he would love to hear that, then smiled and said she thought there was someone who would like to meet her. Martha looked at the phone in her hand and asked if she meant right now, and Evelyn smiled and said if he was awake. Martha laughed and said he has children so he's probably exhausted. Then Evelyn tapped the screen and the phone rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered and asked if everything was okay. Evelyn smiled and said everything was wonderful, and there was a pause before Daniel said that usually means she bought another company. She laughed and said no, this is better, then she looked across the table at Martha and told him she found someone. Silence, then he asked who, and Evelyn swallowed before saying the words she had dreamed of saying for 32 years, she found Martha. The other end of the line went completely quiet, then she heard him take a shaky breath as he asked if she was there right now, and Evelyn smiled and said she was right here. His voice broke as he said he had wanted to meet her his whole life. Evelyn handed the phone across the table, and Martha looked terrified, saying she didn't know what to say, but Evelyn told her just say hello. With trembling hands she took the phone and said hello, and a warm voice answered immediately, saying hi Miss Martha. She smiled through her tears and said hello sweetheart, and Daniel replied that she probably didn't know this but his mom had talked about her his entire life. Martha cried harder as he continued, saying every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every time something good happened, then he said softly that she saved them. Martha closed her eyes and said no, but he insisted yes, saying she gave his mom a chance when nobody else did, and because of that he had a home, he went to college, he met his wife, he has 2 little girls, and they exist because of what she did. Tears rolled down Martha's cheeks and she couldn't speak, neither could Evelyn, until finally Daniel whispered thank you, and the words seemed to fill every corner of the room. 2 simple words, 32 years late, but perfectly timed. 3 weeks later, Martha stood at O'Hare Airport for the first time in her life, clutching the Silver Angel music box tightly in her hands. The arrival doors slid open and a tall man stepped through, then stopped. For a moment neither of them moved, then Daniel smiled, the same smile his father had once worn, the same smile she remembered from a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Martha's hand flew to her mouth as she said, "Oh my goodness," and Daniel walked straight toward her, and before either of them said a word he wrapped his arms around her. They both cried right there in the middle of the airport as he whispered that he had waited his whole life to meet her, and she laughed through her tears saying she had waited her whole life to see what kind of man he would become. He pulled back and smiled, saying he thought she helped with that. A few minutes later 2 little girls came running, calling Grandpa before stopping and asking who she was. Daniel smiled and looked at Martha, then at his daughters, saying, "This is Miss Martha." The girls waved and one of them smiled and said hi, and Martha's heart nearly burst. She knelt slowly and said, "Hello, sweetheart," and the little girl looked at the silver music box and said, "That's pretty." Martha smiled and said, "It is," and the child thought for a moment before taking her hand and saying, "Come with us." Everyone laughed, and just like that a woman who had never had children and never had grandchildren suddenly found herself surrounded by both. A year later the Carter Foundation announced a new program called the Silver Angel Fund, its mission simple, to help struggling single parents facing housing emergencies. Every grant carried a small card with an angel on the front and 6 words inside, "Just keep going, honey." By the end of the first year hundreds of families had been helped, then thousands, one act of kindness becoming thousands more, exactly as Martha had once said, "You don't pay kindness back, you pass it on." The Silver Angel music box sat in a glass case in the foundation's lobby, except once a month on the first Sunday of every month it disappeared. Because it spent that day at Martha's house, where she would wind the little key, listen to "You Are My Sunshine," and smile. Not because she had gotten back a precious object, but because she had gotten back something far more valuable, her family, the one she never expected. And now, my dear friends, before we say goodnight, let me ask you something. Has someone ever shown you kindness at a moment when you had nothing left, someone who changed your life and perhaps never realized how much they mattered? If so, I hope you'll think of them tonight, maybe even call them, because one small act of kindness can echo for generations. I've noticed that the people who change our lives the most are often the ones who expect nothing in return. Martha Reed never asked for gratitude, she never sought recognition, she simply saw a young mother in pain and chose to help. And in doing so, she set in motion a chain of kindness that would touch thousands of lives, including 2 little girls who would grow up knowing their family existed because of a woman they called Miss Martha. If Evelyn and Martha's story touched your heart, please leave a comment and let me know you're here. And don't forget to subscribe to our little family story corner, where we remember the people who quietly change our lives forever. Until next time, stay safe, be kind to one another, and sweet dreams.